And we're seniors at Elgin High School, and we are very excited to welcome you to the 2017 National Biodiversity Teach-In. Today we have a variety of fascinating presenters scheduled. In a few minutes, we will be hearing from Nancy Knowlton,
who will be discussing about the exciting topic of coral reefs. Let's give all a warm welcome to Ms. Knowlton.
So, should I start? I'm assuming so. Okay, so hello everyone, all of you from around the United States. It's really a pleasure to be part of this. I've never done this particular webinar, so we'll just do it and see how it goes. I'll be watching the messages, and I'll try to keep up with the messages as well as show you the slides that I prepared for you. Just a few words about myself. I've been studying coral reefs since 1974, which is not only is it before you all were born, it's probably before a lot of your parents were born. So think of me as your scuba diving grandmother. And it's sometimes in some years I've spent as much as 6 hours a day underwater. It's taken me around the world, everywhere from the coast of Africa to the Great Barrier Reef to the middle of the Pacific Ocean, in places that are so far away from people that they take a couple of days to get there by ship. I've had a chance to be featured in Vanity Fair magazine. I've been introduced to the Pope. So it's a wonderful career, and it's brought me a lot of pleasures, and I want to try to share some of that with you today. So the first picture you see is a picture of a coral reef, and shows where I work, which is the Smithsonian, the National Museum of Natural History here in Washington, D.C. And so you can see a beautiful picture of a coral reef, and you can also see a book that I wrote called Citizens of the Sea. It's not just about coral reefs, but it's about diversity in the ocean, and it's not a very expensive book. Actually, I don't make any money from it. Any little bit of money that comes in goes to the Smithsonian. But some of you might enjoy it because it's written really for young people interested in the ocean. And then also, I think all of you saw the information about the ocean portal, and some of you may have had a chance to check out the article that I recommended. That's a website that I run. And also, if any of you are on Twitter, you can follow me on @SeaCitizens. So let's see. Let me figure out how to move this forward. Okay, so corals are actually interesting as organisms. They're really part animal in a way, part vegetable, and part mineral. So on the left-hand side, you see a diagram of what's called a polyp. It's sort of the individual building block of a coral, and it's a very simple. It's like, imagine like a can of soup with the lid taken off on the top, and where you take off that lid is surrounded by a ring of tentacles, and those tentacles have stinging cells that allow them to capture food from the water. It sits in a little skeleton cup. But in addition, inside the body of many corals are these little green balls, which you see on the right-hand side of the picture, which are called zooxanthellae. It's a fancy scientific word. But mainly, they're basically little kinds of tiny single-celled plants, and they're photosynthetic. They make energy from sun just the way grass and trees do. And so that's why I say that corals are part animal and part vegetable and part mineral. So the other thing is to remember is that even though the structure of the animal is really simple, it can lead to these very, very complicated shapes and structures. So that little polyp that you see can divide and make many polyps, and in the middle you see a colony of those polyps. They're all come from a single original polyp. You can see those rings of tentacles in the mouth and between inside the ring of tentacles. But as the colonies grow, they can grow in a lot of different sizes and shapes. And so you see on the right, as I said, a coral reef, and you see some of them sort of form heads, some of them form branches, some of them almost look like lettuce. And it just all depends on how these individual polyps divide and grow. And the reefs that are built can be very big. In fact, the Great Barrier Reef can be seen from a satellite in outer space. So this tiny little organism, which is the individual parts of which are really smaller than your thumbnail, can make these amazing structures. So they're really pretty amazing. They're quite spectacular examples of how something simple can turn into something really big and complicated. So corals, as being animals, they reproduce like other animals. So and in fact, they reproduce in a way that's sometimes very, very spectacular. So what you see in these three pictures is a coral of getting ready to reproduce and then engaging in reproduction in something that's called mass spawning. So, for example, the corals that I work on in the Caribbean, once a year, over just a few days, the corals get ready to reproduce, and you can see in that top left picture these little pink balls. They look like eggs, but actually they're a bunch of eggs, about 100 eggs glued together with sperm. And so, for example, these corals reproduce every year, 5 to 7 days after the full moon in September. And then, so if you're swimming out on the reef, all of a sudden, all the corals start looking like that. Almost looks like they have acne, these little pink balls. Then all of a sudden, together, they release these balls of eggs and sperm. And you see on the right the eggs and sperm floating to the surface because the eggs are full of fat. So that's why they float to the surface, and they break up, and the eggs from one colony fertilizes the sperm from another colony. So I have a quick question here, which is from Donna M. Do crabs participate in coral formation? Crabs, I would say crabs take advantage of corals as their home. So there are lots and lots of different things that live with coral reefs, and there are lots of crabs. Sometimes there are a few crabs that actually burrow into corals and actually live in little cavities that sit inside the corals. But they don't actually build reefs themselves. It's sort of like, you can almost think of them as like birds in a forest. So, so corals also, in addition to growing and reproducing, they also have to struggle for their existence. Oops, I have a quick question here. Why full moon for reproduction, and do different corals use different moon months? That's a great question. I could talk for an hour about just that. I spent about 15 years of my life studying it. But the main thing is that they don't have the corals are stuck to the ground. I mean, the seafloor, they can't move around. So they release their eggs and sperm all at once. And so if a coral releases its eggs and sperm all by itself, then none of the eggs will get fertilized, and so all that effort of producing the eggs is wasted. So they try to, basically, natural selection favors corals that reproduce at the same time as other corals. And so the full moon is a cue that they use to make sure they're reproducing with all the other members of the same species. Actually, it's more specific than that. It's not only 5 to 7 days after the full moon in September, but some corals, for example, that I work on reproduce between 8 and 9 o'clock at night, and other species reproduce between 9:30 and 10:30 at night. So it's very, very specific. It's an amazing system, which if somebody wants to send me questions afterwards, I can give you more details. Okay, I've got a question about bleaching, and I'm going to come to that shortly, so I'm going to postpone the answer for that in a sec. You'll hear it just a second. As I say, corals have enemies. Basically, they compete for real estate on the seafloor, and in particular, seaweeds can be a real problem for corals because corals have these, as I said, big skeletons, and so they don't grow as fast because they have to produce all this stony substance, whereas many seaweeds can grow very, very quickly and can kind of overgrow and smother corals. And you see an example on the upper left of a coral reef where almost all the corals have been covered up by those seaweeds, which are those stalk-like things that are all over the bottom. And of course, there are things that eat corals as well. And what you see on the lower right is a very, very famous coral predator, which is the crown-of-thorns starfish. And you see that white coral that's sort of in the front, and you can see on just that coral alone, 2 of these big starfish. They're sometimes more than almost a yard in diameter. They're very, very large, and they can eat up almost all of an entire coral reef over the course of a month or so when their numbers get out of control. So they can be a big problem. Corals also, just like us, we get the flu or a bad cold or other diseases. Corals also get sick. And you see some pictures here of sick corals, some of them, and you often can tell a coral is sick because it turns white, and what you're seeing there in that white is sometimes you're looking at the bare skeleton. In other words, all the live part of the coral on the surface has been killed, and you're just looking at like basically coral bones. And so there are a number of different diseases that you see there, and some of them can move really, really quickly. For example, on the upper right-hand corner, you see those white bands. They can sometimes move across the coral at a ½ an inch or more a day. And when you think of the fact that that represents almost a year's worth of growth being killed in a day, they can be really, really, these diseases can be really, really serious problems. And in fact, we've lost almost 97% of all the members of some species in the Caribbean from those white band diseases that have taken place over the last couple of decades. So here's the question. Here, finally, I've gotten to your question about what causes corals to bleach. Bleaching basically is a response to stress. So a number of different kinds of stresses can cause coral bleaching if it's too cold or too bright. But the biggest problem corals face with respect to bleaching is temperature, and that's because of global warming. If the temperature of the water goes about 2 degrees Fahrenheit or 1 degree centigrade over the normal maximum for that time of year, then what happens is that relationship between the corals and those plant cells, the zooxanthellae that I mentioned earlier, that relationship breaks down. The zooxanthellae are actually really sensitive to even small increases in temperature. And so the relationship breaks down and the zooxanthellae leave the coral, and what you see is a reef that has lost all its zooxanthellae, and the corals themselves turn ghostly white. And you can see that in the left-hand picture. That's from Panama in about 2010. And in the right-hand picture, what you see is an individual colony. And if you look closely, you can see the sort of kind of a halo of something surrounding that skeleton. That's actually live tissue. So the corals don't die immediately when they bleach, but the problem is they depend on that photosynthesis, that food that the zooxanthellae make, to keep themselves going. And so if they're bleached for too long, basically they starve to death, and bleaching can therefore be fatal. And in fact, if it's severe, it often is fatal. So I've got a quick question about how long corals live. It really depends on the species. Some corals are really weedy. They might typically only live 15 or 20 years, but others are very, very long-lived and can live even over 1,000 years. So, and I have another question about why are the water temperatures rising? Well, the water temperatures are rising because burning of fossil fuels has put more and more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And carbon dioxide acts like a heat blanket and is causing our temperatures to rise. So, for example, here in Washington, a couple of days ago, it was almost 70 degrees in the middle of February. It's just kind of crazy. And in general, it's getting warmer and warmer. I mean, you can still, you get a general trend, and you can get a cold day. Like today is actually quite cold in Washington. But in general, the temperatures are increasing. And as they're increasing, they're causing bleaching to happen more and more often. I've got a quick question about pollutants. Certainly pollutants can affect corals directly if they're something that's really toxic. For example, there's some concern that even some of the things in sunscreens are very bad for corals. But also pollutants like fertilizer, and I'll say a bit more about this in a second, pollutants like fertilizer help the seaweeds to grow, and so they kind of shift the balance between corals and seaweeds. And so they don't necessarily affect corals directly, but they make it harder for them to compete with the other organisms on the reef. Question about what is the size range of corals. So what you're looking at on this bleaching picture, on the picture on the right, that's actually a single polyp with a ring, it has one mouth in the center. That's actually among the largest individual polyps. That's about 2 inches across. But many times the polyps are much smaller. In fact, you can see on that right-hand picture, on the far right, you see all those little circles. Those are much smaller polyps. They might be more like a quarter of an inch across, but the colony itself can be very, very big. And what you see on that left-hand picture is a reef, and that colony that's right in the front of the picture is probably about a yard or a meter across. So let's see, is it possible to do anything to stop the problems? Absolutely, and I'm going to get to that at the end, so I'm going to postpone the answer to that if you don't mind. And how many different types of corals there are? There are about 1,000, and I'll also talk a little bit about diversity in just a second. There are 1,000 species of corals that build shallow water reef, and there are actually probably about 1,000 additional kinds of corals that live in the deep sea, which don't have zooxanthellae because there's no light. And some of them also build reefs as well. So a little under 2,000 species. So let's see. So let me turn now to why we should care about corals and coral reefs. And there are a number of different reasons, and I'd sort of like to go over those with you. The first of all, and this is what coral reefs are most famous for, is that they're very, very diverse. And people often refer to them as rainforests of the sea. Actually, coral reefs were around before rainforests. You could almost think of rainforests as the coral reefs of the land. But in any case, there are lots and lots of species. Let's see, how big, a question about how is it bad to have coral in a fish tank? It really depends on where the coral came from. Some companies are very responsible about where they get their corals. They take a single colony, and then because they live in these collections of polyps, you can break them into two pieces, and each of them will regrow into a new colony. So as long as they're collected by people who are really responsible and are actually growing them themselves rather than stripping them off the reef itself, then it's fine to have a coral in your fish tank. But you have to know where your corals come from. It's really like anything else. Some corals are sold from very responsible dealers, and others are less so. Okay, and the question from Mrs. S. Elena, you can find, I should have mentioned this earlier, I have a map that I'll show you in a second. The coral reefs live where the shallow water reefs live where the water is warm, so basically in tropical locations. Sort of in the United States, Florida and Hawaii are the most northern parts of the coral reefs. So in terms of the diversity, I got that question about how many species of corals there are. And there are only, it seems like a lot, say 1,000 species that live in shallow water, but that's actually a tiny number compared to the total number of things that live on corals themselves. And so if you take a piece of coral and flip it over in the part that's hidden from the sun, you see the undersurface is covered with all these different kinds of organisms, sponges and moss animals and all sorts of little crabs and shrimp. It's just a ton of stuff growing on the underside of corals. And then in and among the corals are also all these amazing creatures, including vis-a-vis the question about crabs that I got earlier, lots and lots of crabs that live on corals, and you see a bunch of them in this picture. And so although there are only a couple thousand species of corals, there are probably somewhere between 1 and 9 million species that live on reefs altogether. And in fact, they probably represent about 1/4 of everything that lives in the ocean lives with coral reefs. And that's amazing when you think about it, because if you take all the coral reefs and squash them down into a single place, it's really only the size of Texas. So to have so much diversity in such a small space relative to the total size of the globe is pretty incredible. So, okay, I've got a couple of questions here. I don't want to lose track of them. Just a second. So how do corals protect themselves from predators? That's a really interesting question, and it's actually related to the next question I have, which is coral edible. So the coral, I mean, some things, as I mentioned, crown of thorns starfish eat corals. There's some snails that eat corals. People don't normally eat corals, and that's just because the amount of living tissue that's on the surface relative to the amount of skeleton is really small. So it's sort of like chewing on a fruit where almost everything was the seed, and there was no, like, imagine a peach where the pit of the peach is essentially the whole peach, and there's just a little bit of skin on the outside. So that's sort of the challenge of eating corals. It's mostly made out of rock. But there are some organisms that do a good job, and the corals themselves have a hard time doing much about their predators, but because of these crabs, and you can see some of them here in this picture, and then also shrimp, some corals have crabs and shrimp that live with them. And in fact, when something like a crown of thorns starfish comes and tries to eat it, the crabs and the shrimp jump out and pinch with their claws the predator and drive them away. So that's one way that corals protect themselves from getting eaten. So goodness, I have questions coming in really fast here. Let me see. How many different types of coral reefs worldwide are in danger of disappearing? I'll give you a little bit more information soon, but we think that we've lost probably about 50% of all the coral in the last 30 or 40 years. Now that doesn't mean that all 50% of the reefs are gone, but on many reefs, many of the corals are dead, is how I describe it. And coral reefs form, Melanie B, because the corals themselves keep growing, and they lay down the skeleton as part of their body, and then the skeleton accumulates, and as the reef grows up, there's more and more skeleton underneath the live part of the reef, and so that's how the stony reef is actually formed by the corals. And the question is, are any crab species endangered? Probably, although we don't know too much about all these thousands and thousands of crab species. So, but any crab species that is really dependent on live coral and doesn't exist in many places around the world is definitely potentially threatened. And what colors are most common in corals? Well, you've seen a couple of pictures. They tend to be tan or beige or light green or gray or yellow. And those are the colors of the zooxanthellae that live with them. So every once in a while, particularly in the Pacific, some of them are sort of pink and blue, but the most common colors are the grays and greens and browns because of the algae that live inside them. And the food chain I'm going to get to in just a second. So give me just a few seconds here. So I want to say since this is a biodiversity teach-in, I did want to say a few more words about diversity. This is a picture taken by a National Geographic photographer named David Lichfager, and he photographed everything found in 1 cubic foot during a single day on a coral reef in Moorea, Moorea is near Tahiti. It's in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. You can see the huge number of things that was found even in that tiny space on that reef. The question, are corals poisonous? Typically, they're not poisonous to eat, but some of them have, there's a kind of coral called a fire coral, which actually has a very bad sting. It has very powerful stinging tentacles, so it's more stinging than poisonous per se. And are there any above ground corals? Great question, Donna M. Yes, and in fact, there are many places where you can go and actually see what were living coral reefs that have risen up through geological processes. So the coral itself won't grow above water, but if you have an earthquake, say, or the ground is just generally rising because continents are colliding with each other and pushing land up, then what used to be a living coral reef is brought above the water, so it can't continue to grow. But you can go to places in Florida, for example, and many other places around the world and see what were live corals sort of preserved permanently in these fossil reefs, as I say, around the world. So let's see, how are we doing here? So the biggest coral reef in the world, that's from Melanie B. That's is the Great Barrier Reef, and the second off the east coast of Australia. Second biggest coral reef is the Mesoamerican Barrier Reef off the coast of Mexico and Belize and Honduras and Guatemala. And a question about dredging. Yes, dredging sand can definitely cause a lot of disturbance to coral reefs, and and kill them. So whenever you're dredging in a place where reefs grow, you're basically killing reefs. I want to say something about this next slide about the value of reefs in addition to their diversity. So all those red dots, I had an earlier question about where you find reefs. All those red dots are where we find reefs. So you can see, as I said, they're mostly in the tropics. They go down to the coast. In the north, Hawaii and Bermuda are the top of the range, and then in the southern hemisphere, Africa and down the coast of Australia and Brazil are the southernmost reefs. They're worth a lot of money, and they're worth money not necessarily for the reason you think. So you can definitely earn money by fishing from coral reefs, and in fact, many people around the planet, especially in developing countries, actually depend very heavily on fish that are caught on coral reefs. So they're very important for food, but a lot of the value of coral reefs comes from the sort of stuff that you don't take just by being there. For example, tourism is a huge industry around the world, and many people pay to come and scuba dive or snorkel on coral reefs, and those tourists provide jobs for people around the world. And in addition, because these coral reefs are kind of hard, stony structures, when there's a big wave associated with big storms or a tsunami from an earthquake, they actually protect the people by breaking up the wave and making it less powerful. And so typically people estimate that reefs are worth almost $30 billion a year, which is actually quite a lot of money. But most of it comes from their being there, not from the stuff you take out from them. Just by being there, they're worth a lot of money. I've got a question about coral reefs being endangered, and I'll be answering that very soon. So, right now. So that's a picture I took when I was a student back in 1975 of the coral reef in Discovery Bay, Jamaica. And it looks beautiful. There's lots of live coral in that picture. You see all that branching stuff, that's all live coral. Those big heads, that's all live coral. But what you don't see in that picture are many fish. And that's a problem because the fish eat the seaweeds, which compete with corals. But at the time, back in 1975, we didn't realize that these coral reefs were endangered. They looked beautiful because the live coral was so spectacular, and we kind of took them, to be honest, we took them for granted. And that was a big mistake because within about 10 years, those reefs were lost. They got cut. There are a lot of different things happened. There was a big hurricane and a lot of coral disease. And so by 1985, 10 years after I started, 11 years after I started studying coral reefs, they disappeared. The corals mostly died, and they got covered with seaweeds, and that's it was one of the first things that happened to me as as grown up. I had a job, and I'd gotten my advanced degree studying coral reefs, and then within a year, or within 10 or 11 years of starting to study them, all the reefs that I had studied in Jamaica were in terrible shape. So it was really an early lesson about how fragile reefs can be and how quickly they can die if they're not well taken care of. So, and then this is a picture taken quite a bit later, only about 4 years ago. This is a picture taken from the Philippines. The State Department actually asked me to go to the Philippines and talk to people there about coral reefs and the importance of coral reefs. And they took me on a dive, and this is the picture. This is a picture from that dive. This was a really depressing place because not only are almost all the corals dead, you see a few bleached corals here and there, but almost all the picture is seaweed. In addition, I didn't see a single fish during the entire dive. And that meant that there's basically nothing for the people in this part of the Philippines to eat. And so I was told that fishermen could go on the shore and cast their net for fish, and after a whole hour of fishing, all they would catch were just a few fish, and really the number of calories in what they catch was sort of basically equivalent to a can of Coca-Cola. So if you had to work for an hour to just get a can of Coca-Cola and there was nothing to eat, that's it's an issue of food security for these countries where the reefs are falling to pieces. I got a question about what animals eat corals. As I mentioned a bit earlier, you have starfish that eat corals, crown of thorns starfish. You have snails that eat corals. You have fish that eat corals. Those are probably the three. And then there are actually some worms that eat corals. So those are the four big groups of animals that eat corals. Some worms that eat corals. So those are the four big groups of animals that eat corals. So, I sort of mentioned before, a lot of the things that that are happening to coral reefs are due to things that happen locally, right around the reefs themselves, and in particular, fertilizer and other kinds of nutrients and overfishing, taking away the fish. They upset the ecological balance on coral reefs, and so basically, if you put too much nutrients in the water, then the algae grow really quick, the seaweeds grow really quickly, and they smother the corals. And if you take away the fish, then they, in some cases, the fish are important for eating the seaweed, and in other cases, which you see on the left there's a fish, and then sort of that striped shell, that's called a triton shell. It's actually eating a crown of thorns starfish. And so the fish are important for eating the seaweeds and eating the things that eat corals. And so if you have a lot of nutrients and too much fishing, essentially the reefs have a hard time surviving. So the question I have here is, can coral reefs reconstruct themselves after being partly destroyed or after a natural disaster? And the answer to that question, fortunately, is absolutely. And in fact, coral reefs normally have to deal with big storms and other kinds of things that happen to them, or being eaten by their natural predators. And the reason they can thrive is because that colony, you can take a bite out of it, but it can make new polyps and grow back. So coral reefs, left to their own devices, are actually pretty resilient. The problem is we're doing so many things that stress them out. It makes it much harder for them to recover from natural disasters. But if they're well protected, they definitely can bounce back. And about how many different species can live on a reef? On a single reef, well, thousands and thousands and thousands. And as I say, the estimates for around the world is at least 1 million or 2 million, maybe quite a bit more. And how do coral reefs interact with other organisms? Mainly, they provide a home for other organisms. So there are all these things that live with coral reefs, and so that's I think their primary role in terms of their ecology. So as I said, a lot of the problems for reefs are that they are things that happen locally, but climate change is also making things much worse. And I had a couple questions before the start of this webinar about the Great Barrier Reef, and these are two pictures of the Great Barrier Reef, because in 2016 we had very, very hot water in the ocean all around the world, and in particular in the northern part of the Great Barrier Reef, it was so hot that in some cases, almost the entire reef bleached and most of the reef died. And so what you see is a before and after picture from March 2016, where all the corals are bleached on the reef, and then 2 months later, all the reef is dead. And that's pretty upsetting because it takes hundreds and hundreds of years to grow a reef as big as the one that you see in that picture. And so climate change is caused by burning of fossil fuels and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and so we're definitely contributing to the destruction of reefs because we're a big part of what's causing warming of the planet right now. So I have a question. Let me just make sure I get to the whole thing. I'm going to say a few words. Let's see. Whoa, I've got a lot of questions here. How do coral reefs? Is there fishing moratoriums in place to protect reefs? Well, as I mentioned on the Great Barrier Reef, there are whole places which are permanently off limits to fishing, and the same is true in the Hawaiian Islands, same is true in Florida. So a lot of places have created what are called marine protected areas where no fishing is allowed, and that's good because it provides a safe place for the fish to grow and reproduce, and then they actually can leave the protected area and do good things for reefs even outside the protected area. So there are definitely fishing protections, and in other places what they have is a more cyclic, some places in developing countries, for example, they may not be able to prevent fishing all the time, but they say at certain months of the year you can't fish. So there are a number of ways of creating safe havens for the fish that are really important for reefs. And in terms of what we can do to protect coral reefs. Well, I mean, no, some of you probably live a long way from reefs, but you can definitely help simply by being efficient in your use of energy and recycling things. When you're buying stuff, make sure there are no coral reef products in there that are endangered. There are lots and lots of resources, and you can just go online and search for what can we what can we do to protect coral reefs. And in fact, there's some information about that on the website on the Ocean Portal as well. And I have one more question here. Okay, so if one part of the coral reef is taken away and destroyed, could it potentially unwind the binding of an entire reef? That's a really good question. It's definitely the case that, for example, if you have a ship that runs into the reef and it grinds the reef into lots of little pieces, sometimes it's pretty hard for the reef to get reestablished because every time a wave goes over, those little pieces roll around, and it's hard for it to get reestablished. Eventually it will, but it slows things down. It kind of depends on the nature of the damage. A little bit of damage is not a big problem. If you destroy the entire reef and it's all turned into little tiny pieces, then it actually slows things down quite a lot. And what would happen if all the sea creatures, if the reefs disappeared? Well, we might lose, they say about a quarter of the animals that live in the ocean live with coral reefs. So they might not all disappear, but you might lose quite a few of them. So we'd lose a lot of species if that happened. And how can we help coral reefs? I think I just answered that question. Okay, so a question about nitrogen and phosphorus. Let me get to that because I think that might even be the next slide. So the thing about carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is some of it causes warming, but some of it also dissolves into the ocean, and it makes the ocean more acidic. It lowers the pH. And so here you see a picture of a place where the pH is normal, and then on the right you see a picture where the pH is low. And in this particular case, it's because the pH there's carbon dioxide bubbling out of volcanic vents from the seafloor. And so you can see there's a big decrease of diversity between the left-hand picture and the right-hand picture. But in addition, most of the carbon dioxide coming into the water now is coming through human activities. And so you have the same problem of too much carbon dioxide in the water as well as in the atmosphere. Makes it very hard for coral reefs to build their skeletons because the more acidic the water, it's not actually acidic, but the lower the pH, the harder it is for the chemical reactions that are needed to build a skeleton to occur is really the easiest way to explain it. So if you take, for example, a piece of chalk and put it in a glass of Coca-Cola, it sort of dissolves, and the same thing is, in a way, is happening on coral reefs. But it's not, ocean acidification is not caused by nitrogen and phosphorus. They cause problems by helping the seaweeds grow fast, but they don't cause acidification. And stormwater, again, carries a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus, but it's more because of the effect it has on seaweeds than it is on acidification. Okay, and then at this rate, how long will it take for coral reefs to entirely disappear? Well, you could lose a lot of coral reefs by 2050, but hopefully, as people become more and more aware, at this rate is no longer going to be we're going to slow the rate down. So in fact, we will have coral reefs still in 2050. They all disappeared. It would take a couple hundred years for them to rebound because as I mentioned, they grow slowly. The reefs that you see, the big head corals that you see on that right-hand picture, they only grow about an inch a year. So it takes a long time to regrow a reef that is, several yards or more in height. All right, let me see. So what to do? And the question about coral reef products, there are actually some medicines that come from sponges on coral reefs. But I'd say most of the products are really, as I tried to describe before, they're more that people go to visit them and see them and the jobs that they provide from tourism, and the reefs feed people because of the fish on the reef. You can see some of those fish here. I have a question about, can you replant a reef? Yes, you can, but it doesn't do any good to replant a reef unless what killed the reef originally, the problems that killed the reef originally, are fixed. So there is a lot of work on reef restoration going around, but you actually have to fix the overfishing and pollution problems before you can replant a reef. Otherwise, the things that you replant will die just the way the original reef did. question about, do they give off waste? Yes, they're animals, so corals give off waste just like all other animals do. So what to do? So I'd like to show you, I want to end on a more cheerful note. This is again in 2013, I went on I spent a month in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And it's a place it's called the Kiribati Republic. It's sort of, if you took a plane due south of Hawaii and flew below the equator to the southern hemisphere, and it's these reefs that are sort of halfway between Hawaii and Tahiti. They're so far away from people that there's no pollution and there's no overfishing, and this is what the reefs look like. Absolutely spectacular. The whole bottom is covered with live coral, and their water is full of fish and other kinds of fish and sharks and turtles. They're amazing. And so what reefs like this tell you is that actually, if you protect them, it works. It won't work indefinitely in the sense that we really do have to fix the problem of climate change and the acidification of the ocean, but keeping local stressors away from reefs, overfishing and pollution, buys incredibly valuable time while we figure out how to deal with the more complicated problem of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So that's, I think, a really optimistic message. And so I'd like to close with a couple of slides, and then I'll just answer questions as they come in if you want. So a lot of you have asked the question, what can we do? And sometimes it seems like these problems are so difficult and challenging. And so I wanted to share with you an African proverb that I think is really nice to make you realize that there's a ton you can do. So the proverb is, if you think you are too small to make a difference, you haven't spent the night with a mosquito. I'm sure all of you have spent the night with a mosquito, and you know how bothersome a mosquito can be. Well, in the positive sense, you can be just one person or small groups of people, but they can make a huge difference in terms of how healthy not only coral reefs are, but just the ocean in general. And so I actually started getting to be really interested in what people could do and what positive things were happening, because we've lost so many coral reefs over the last 30 years, it can be really depressing, actually, to work on them, because you see them dying and you think, what can I do? And then I started realizing, actually, you can do quite a lot as individuals and supporting different organizations that help with coral reefs. And you can make a really big difference. And what I realized in starting to think about this, there were already a lot of people making a big difference. And so I started with some colleagues of mine, friends that work on oceans. We started a Twitter campaign called #OceanOptimism. What we did was we used the Twitter hashtag to identify all the examples of good things that were happening that people were doing to help the ocean. And so I encourage those of you who are students or teachers on Twitter, just go online and search for #OceanOptimism, and every day you'll find 15 to 20 examples of what people are doing around the world. They're everything from recycling to energy efficiency to growing their food locally to cleaning up trash. I mean, trash, even from the middle of the country, if it winds up in the rivers, it winds up in the ocean. So there's all sorts of things you can do, really important things that you can do to make the ocean and just the planet in general a better place. And I'm really glad I see this here. We want to be marine biologists. Luis wants to know how you started in this career path. Well, as I mentioned right at the beginning, I spent a lot of time by the ocean. And so I've always been interested in science, but actually I started off being more interested in astronomy. But because I spent my summers by the ocean at my grandparents' houses, I got interested in the ocean. I had a wonderful biology teacher in high school. Then after I graduated from college, I worked for a woman named Ruth Turner, who was the first woman to go down to the bottom of the seafloor, very, very deep, in a deep water submarine called Alvin. And she inspired me to be a marine biologist. And then when I went to graduate school after I got my bachelor's degree, I took a course in Jamaica. That's how I started off working in Jamaica. And I just fell completely in love with coral reefs because they were so spectacularly beautiful. And that's really how I got on my career path. Question about how sharp is corals. They can be, it depends. Some of them aren't, I mean, all of them are made out of stony material. Some of them can be very sharp. Others are less sharp. It kind of depends on the coral. Some of those ones you see in the front of this picture can be pretty sharp, those little spiky things sticking up, and others are more smooth in terms of the skeleton, so they're not quite so sharp. So I have a question. I love this hashtag. Yes, I love this hashtag too. It's reached. It's amazing. It's been so successful. It's been used by Huffington Post and the World Bank. It's reached 70 million Twitter accounts. It's the most amazing social media thing I've ever done in my whole career. It's been super successful. So I want to conclude. I think this is the last slide. I want to tell you about something that we're doing. Oops, a quick question. Can you tell the difference between a male and a female? Well, in corals, actually, some of them are hermaphrodites. That is, they're both males and females at the same time. That picture I showed towards the beginning of this talk, it was really a picture of these little pink balls, and they were actually eggs and sperm that were wrapped up together, produced by a single polyp. And so a lot of corals are both male and female at the same time. The male parts produce sperm and the female parts produce eggs. And then some of them have separate sexes, so one colony will just produce eggs, and another colony the male colonies will just produce sperm. And I'm so glad, Valerie, that you're following our Twitter account. That's great. And as I say, you can find all sorts of things under #OceanOptimism. So I just wanted to tell you at the Smithsonian, I have a few more minutes, so I think I can get this in and then answer a few more questions. So on Earth Day weekend, which is the 21st to the 23rd of April this year, the Smithsonian is hosting what we're calling an Earth Optimism Summit. And what we're going to do is spend 3 days talking about and sharing all the positive things that are happening on the planet. And we're identifying those, taking off from #OceanOptimism. You can follow #EarthOptimism. And this summit, although it's in DC, we're going to live stream a lot of it, so you'll be able to watch it on TV. And then really, perhaps the most important thing is we're encouraging other groups to also hold Earth Optimism events. So if your school wants to celebrate the positive things that are happening in your community to make the environment a healthier place for the animals and plants around you and for people, I really encourage you to get in touch with me or look at the website, which is earthoptimism.si.edu, and find out how you can host your own Earth Optimism event. So, because it's really important not to get depressed by there's always going to be bad news. There's a lot of good news out there as well, and we don't spend enough time talking about the good news. And I think all of you, teachers and students, will find it very inspirational, some of the things that are happening around the world, which most people don't know about. There's sort of like well-kept secrets. So I encourage you to participate. Go to that website, earthoptimism.si.edu, and you'll find out how you can also be part of the Earth Optimism movement. So a quick question from EHSB: how can wildlife biology and marine biology correspond and achieve the same conservation goals? Well, I think there are actually a lot of things in common between wildlife biology and marine biology. I mean, some of conservation involves basic science, actually figuring out what's important to animals and plants to know how to protect them. And then in some parts of conservation is more working with people, because it's actually, of course, what people do that affects the health of the environment. So there are lots and lots of different ways, everything from cell biology and molecular biology and ecology to economics and anthropology and even the arts. There are all sorts of different ways that you can contribute to the health of the environment. And I guess what I would urge all of you as students to think about is what do you most like to do? What are you really good at? What do you really enjoy? And then use that talent to help make the planet a healthier place, because there's room for really anyone who wants to contribute to a healthy planet and conservation. Just take your skills and your enthusiasms and go online and figure out what other people are doing, form groups. I know, for example, there's a couple of kids called the Oh My God Kids, OMG Kids, I think, and they've started writing curriculum. They've started a straw banning project because straws are plastic and don't degrade, and they have another project on protecting pangolins in China. So there are young people all over the place that are doing really cool things. There's a group called Teen Dreams, which have video contests, and there's going to be more about this. We're having a whole part of the Earth Optimism Summit is going to be about young people, so stay tuned on that front, and there'll be more information there as well. Okay, so let's see, where are we in terms of questions? Oh, I'm glad, Valerie S., that you're. Yes, I think Tom Lovejoy might have talked about the Earth Optimism Summit on the previous webinar. He's working with us on that. And then were corals around when the dinosaurs? Absolutely. Corals were around before there was anything on the land. So they're much older than dinosaurs, much older than rainforests. Different kinds of things lived a long time ago rather than now, but the corals are very, very ancient. I think corals, even the corals that we know are about hundreds of millions of years old, way before the dinosaurs. And then another question, if coral reefs were destroyed, how could it affect aquatic life? Well, as I mentioned, that reefs are home to a lot of different species, and there are a lot of communities around the planet, all over the world, that depend on them in terms of food and jobs and protecting the coastal communities. So there are lots of different ways. Oh, good. Thank you, Valerie. Yes, post about it and spread the word. That's fantastic. That's the way things happen, is we talk to each other and we share what's working. It's really positivity can go a long way in terms of making the world a better place. And what is one small thing we can do to help? Well, I'd say it depends, of course, on where you live. If you live right next to a coral reef, there are all sorts of different things you can do in terms of helping people protect them from overfishing and pollution. But most of you don't live right next to a reef. I would say use resources widely. So, for example, if you're thirsty, you should always have a water bottle with you. You shouldn't constantly be buying new plastic bottles and more plastic, because those plastic bottles are made by using fossil fuels, and and not only does that contribute to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the plastic doesn't degrade, so the plastic bottle winds up often in the ocean or in some garbage dump. And so that's just one example. So whenever you're doing things, like when you walk out of the room, turn off the lights. When you're buying things, try to minimize the amount of plastic in the stuff that you buy. Recycle whatever you can. And then talk to people and be enthusiastic about nature. Go out in the world, take pictures, share them with your friends. There's all sorts of, it's what you're doing, it's both what you're doing personally as individuals and the communities of people that you're influencing by talking to them, your family, your friends, anyone that you interact with. So we are going for a field trip. Oh, great. Excellent. As I say, please, when you go into Earth Optimism, let us know what you're doing, and we'll put it on our website, because we really want to have people. We have people already from all sorts of places around the world that are working on Earth Optimism. And if you let us know what you're doing, then we will put it on your website, and you'll be able to see your project on our website. Anyone can participate. Any small, large, it really doesn't matter. We want it to be a global event. Okay, how many fish die per year per coral bleaching? Boy, that's a really hard question. I don't, there's certainly, when the reefs all bleach and die, there are definitely fish that die, but I'd be a little reluctant to give you an exact number. Quite a few, for example, in the northern Great Barrier Reef last year with bleaching, but I don't have that number. I don't like to make numbers up. Sorry, I can't answer that specifically. I'm glad you're inspired, and thank you, Donna, for listening. And are all the world's reefs connected somehow? Of course, they're all connected to us as people. But, the ocean, we often say at the Smithsonian, we have we don't have a Pacific Ocean, an Atlantic Ocean, an Indian Ocean. We have one large interconnected ocean. And although an individual fish might not, some fish actually go all around the world. Most of them stay a little bit closer to home, but they're all connected either directly or indirectly through their babies. And then also, of course, pollution by fossil fuels, that affects the atmosphere, and the ocean. The atmosphere is completely interconnected. So we're all interconnected. It's a one big ocean, and we're all interconnected with it. So it's really important to remember that we're not isolated, that what we do affects everything. And I'm so glad you learned a ton. There's a lot of information on the website. As I say, think about, it's not expensive, Citizens of the Sea. I think you'll really enjoy it. You can read the reviews on Amazon. Kids your age, elementary, middle school, high school, I've got a lot of enthusiasm for the book, and there's lots of fun information in it. And it is 10:56. I think a few more questions if you have them, but and we're close out of time. This has been a lot of fun. I haven't done anything like this for a while. Are there any benefits to coral bleaching? That's actually a very interesting question. People have argued that bleaching is a way of corals getting rid of bad zooxanthellae and replacing them with ones that are better in some way, say more heat tolerant. I think the analogy that's most relevant is a fever. For example, if you're sick and you're running a fever, it can get really dangerous. In fact, a really high fever can kill you. But raising the body temperature probably helps you fight off the things that are making you sick. So, but if it gets out of control, it's bad. It's the same thing with bleaching. A little bit of bleaching might even be helpful, but what we're seeing is this mass bleaching, and that's definitely not helpful. That's catastrophic. Thanks very much, Bridget. Thank you, Deb P. as well. I'm doing my best. This is fun. It's actually kind of interesting, sort of flipping back and forth between the materials you present and then answering these questions that keep scrolling up. I'm happy to stay online. Oh, good. I'm glad, Valerie, you liked it. Yes, it is weirdly interactive. Deb, Valerie, you liked it. Yes, it is weirdly interactive. Deb, it's been fun. You're all very welcome. Thanks for all the positive feedback. I'll be happy to do this anytime you want me to do it. It's been really enjoyable from my side as well. And I have to say, I spend a lot of my time these days. I spend a lot of time still doing science. I have a whole science career, but a big part of what I do is talk about what I know, because it's really important that especially the stuff that I do on conservation and the good things that are happening around the world, people need to know about them, because it's inspiring and it gets other people to also help. So you're right, Valerie. Yes, this is the key: sharing with others, and that's what I'm doing today, and that's what I encourage all of you to do. It's the most important thing you can do, really. Real living scientist. Well, so I still qualify at 67. I'm still a real living scientist. Hashtag real living scientist. I'll have to look for that. There's some great things about scientists actually on Twitter. Field work fails, I think, is one of all the disasters that people have encountered while trying to do science. There's all sorts of fun things you can find about scientists on the web. Thank you, Kenyon W. I'm a big fan of Twitter. I know not everyone likes it, but I find it a great way of sharing information. Facebook as well. The Ocean Portal website has an active Twitter account and an active Facebook account. Both. My pleasure.